solution here, at least one worth debating, is to alter the organization of how we produce. Where is it written that a small group of people whose interest is maximizing profits for themselves and the shareholders that put them in that job, they ought to be in a position to make all the decisions and we live with all the debris that results? Why in the world would you accept that? Those of you that are Americans and take the concept of democracy seriously, how interesting. You seem to want democracy in the community and in politics, but the minute you go to work, you forgot. It's not present. Why does democracy stop at the entrance to your workplace? Why don't you demand that the workplace also be a place where those who have to live with the decisions participate in making them? Why not say that the democratization of the economic space is the part of democracy that was left out and that has undone the little bit of democracy we got in our politics? So that even if you want only democracy in politics, you still have to democratize the economic because that's a condition for it to be there in politics. You know, if the workers themselves, not an original thought, if the workers themselves ran the corporations collectively, if they were their own collective board of directors, here's a to conclude with. Do you think in the 1970s they would have stopped raising their own wages when their productivity kept going up? Unlikely. Would they have moved their jobs to another part of the world? Probably not. And you know, if they had kept their jobs and their wages had gone up, would they have needed to work themselves to exhaustion and to borrow all that money? Probably not. You know why we know that? Because for the previous 100 years they hadn't done that. Because their wages were going up, they didn't borrow. They had old-fashioned commitments to thrift and silly old ideas like that. But we're a society that not only doesn't have the organizations to fight what's happening to us, but we have to learn that there are alternatives, not just to this or that policy, as I've tried to give you along the way, but to the basic way we organize the production of goods and services we all depend on. We've taken that as somehow a given, an untouchable, a beyond reach. And that hands victory to our enemies before the battle starts. It's a terrible self-disarmament in what ought to be a lively debate among different positions. Here's a little parable. Once upon a time, people thought that the only way to live in a community was to have a single leader, a king, an emperor, a czar. If we didn't have somebody who was in charge right at the top, why, we'd all end up slaughtering each other, and life would be impossible, and civilization would end. Then along came an unbearable situation. We separated these folks, these czars and kings, from their heads. And guess what happened? Did civilization end? No. Did life as we know it become unbearable? No. We look upon them as historical relics, and upon the countries that still have to have a king and queen as slightly retarded. And once upon a time, it was thought that when you get to be 15 or 16 years old and you reach your sexual maturity and it's time to find a partner, that the obvious and only conceivable way of doing that is to have your parents go out there and find a suitable family with a spouse, a partner for you. The idea that you, at the age of 15 or 16 or 17, would yourself go out there, look around, see what there was, you with your youth, your raging hormones and all of that, you couldn't possibly do. Why, it would be the end of the family and the end of civilization. And then young people began to tell their parents go away, that they could manage this selection at least as well as their parents had done, if they did it on their own, and society has survived. So here's a thought. If we change the organization of production, and we make the people who come to work all have 2 job descriptions, the specific job you do Monday to Thursday, but on Friday, you come to work and you sit around all day in meetings and you decide what to produce, how to produce, where to produce, and what to do with the profits. Here's a thought for those of you from the left tradition. Throughout the last 150 years, the Marxist, socialist, communist traditions have talked about an alternative to capitalism in macro terms. The government will take over, socialize means of production, planning instead of markets. What I'm proposing is not that that's not a reasonable set of things to suggest. What I'm proposing is that we realize there was a missing micro component, that there was something that had to go along with all of that, that was a change at the base of society, in the actual enterprise of each store, office, factory, warehouse, that the people themselves have to have a radical transformation of their personal experience of work. If a revolution is going to mean both a change in the way society develops, but also a change in the way you develop. I think if you go to the American working class now, facing what it actually faces in what's coming down upon them, they're no longer in a capitalism that, as I was going to school, my teachers told me, delivers the goods. It doesn't. And there are all kinds of political and cultural possibilities for a capitalism that's imploding on itself, that it would be a terrible shame if folks like you did not now take advantage of whatever it is that brought you, and I am flattered beyond words, to this place this evening, bespeaks a concern and an interest. I have done more, just personally, I have done more public speaking, radio, television, meetings like this, in the last 18 months than I have in my entire life up to that point. I cannot meet the demands on my time. And those come from commercial radio stations. The one I like to tell people about, because I know it'll strike a chord, is the program I do fairly often now, an AM station in Salt Lake City, where the interviewer begins each program that they to his audience that he is a Republican and a Mormon, but he has this interesting professor on his program, me. And then each of those hour-long interviews, he and I kid you not, agree on everything. And he brings me back. A year and a half ago, at his invitation, I spent 7 minutes on national television with Glenn Beck. And he and I agreed for those 7 minutes with his 10 million viewers that having wealthy private institutions, in this case Yale University in New Haven, Connecticut, where I lived for many years, pay no taxes to the communities in which they live, is an outrage against the fundamental commitment to a democratic society. He and I agreed on that. The opportunities I have are a measure of a changed economic situation and political situation in the United States. Whatever upset you feel hearing about tea parties, let me assure you that there is a sea change in what it is possible to say and speak in the American culture at this time. I attack and criticize capitalism. I don't beat around the bush. I do it directly. And have I convinced everybody? Hardly. But from being outside the allowable range of discourse, I have found myself in the last 18 months inside. People react to what I say with argument. Yes, no, strong points, weak points. I can speak. So now it's on us to go out there, to speak, to make the organizations that can speak to large numbers of people, because we have an opportunity we have not had in this country for half a century. And it would be the worst of all tragedies if we missed it. Thank you very much for your attention.
Rick, I'll put the first question to you from myself. In your critique of austerity, you said one viable solution: tax the wealthy, tax the corporations. What we constantly hear from the punditocracy of this country is that if you do that, they will simply move to other countries. There will be no one left to tax.
So you want a response?
I want a response.
The beauty of the question, as in all such questions, is what is unspoken and simply presumed. The corporations will leave. What in the world what does that mean? What, will they take that big building on Madison Avenue in New York and move it? No. This is a game of cat and mouse. It's a game of bargaining. It, by the way, happens in business all the time. You propose something, the counterparty doesn't want it, and they threaten they'll do something terrible. That's a gambit. They can't. They have facilities here, resources here, and the answer of a government that had any courage at all would be, don't you threaten me, because if you do, I will threaten you, and I'm as good at it as you are. It's a little bit like going to the government of the United States, or the government of California, or the government of San Francisco, or Oakland, and being told, well, we have to pay our debts. No, you don't. Every day in our economy, people who owe money don't pay. It's a game. You sit down with your creditor and you explain to the creditor, you got two choices. If you push me to pay you everything I owe you, I will declare bankruptcy and you won't get anything. So you better cut a deal with me. And the deal is, I'm going to pay you 60 cents of every dollar I owe you, or 71 cents, or 42, and they dicker. Let me give you an example. The last large country to say that it would not pay its debts, let's be real clear here, was Argentina. At the beginning of this decade, the last decade, beginning of the new millennium, Argentina experienced a terrible economic collapse, and one of the things that happened was that it could not pay its debts. So it said to the world, including many banks here in the United States, not going to pay you. Hello, we're not paying you. Now you have it two ways. They sat down with the bankers. You can either work something out with us, or you get nothing. And we're prepared, the Kirchner government, we're prepared to mobilize the mass of people in Argentina. And not only will you not get your money back, but you're going to have a very unpleasant time in this country for the next 50 years. You probably don't want that. So let's sit down. Make a long story short. The banks screamed, the American government screamed, you must honor your debt. No one will ever lend to you again. They paid 60 cents on the dollar. And they're doing fine. Everybody's lending to Argentina like it never happened. So when you're told these things can't be done, no, don't do that. That's mistaking a gambit in a negotiation for a fixed impossibility. That's falling for the other guy's argument when you really ought to be savvier than that. Greece is not going to pay its debts. Everyone is involved, knows it. There's just an elaborate theater on the way to it. So if American corporations were to say, if you taxed us, we're going to leave, then the answer is, if you even think of doing that, we will come down on